The Morrison government will compensate 430,000 welfare recipients who were wrongly accused of misreporting their income after agreeing to the country's largest class action payout. Let's go live now to the Minister for Government Services, Stuart Robert. Thanks so much for your time. Will you apologise now to the thousands of victims that your government targeted?
Well, thanks, Laura. The Prime Minister's already apologised on behalf of the nation in Parliament, as is fitting, and I certainly join him in that apology.
How did you get this so wrong? Is a Royal Commission now necessary?
Laura, the use of ATO average income data to determine eligibility for benefits goes back decades and decades, almost 30 years to the Hawke and Keating years. So this has been a part of the social welfare or social services platform for decades and decades and decades. It's simply this government that has finally turned that off and decided that further proof points will be sufficient to raise debt. So unfortunately, it's been a long-standing practice.
It hasn't been a long-standing practice, though. It is very clear that this practice of Robodebt did start after the 2013 election, and it was your government.
Well, I'll reject that premise, Laura, because it does go back decades. I've got letters from 1994 which state very clearly that this practice is in place and being used. We've done sampling of the years from 07 through to 13, and it was used in 25% of cases. Now, this government used it more extensively, but the practice has been well used since the Hawke and Keating years.
OK, well, how many of these class action cases actually occurred before 2013 under the previous governments that you speak of?
Well, the class action only specifically began for cases from 2015 forward. So by virtue of the terms of reference of the class action, it couldn't have gone back prior to 2015.
Well, isn't it true that you removed safeguards, relied on automated systems rather than humans doing the work? You also reversed the onus of proof, and you relied too heavily on an income averaging tool that was wrong.
The use of income averaging, as I said, had gone back decades and decades. From 2015 onwards, the government continued to use that. There was always a person in the chain that sought to engage with Australians. It was just done at scale.
Yes,
unfortunately,
yes, that's right. Data matching is not new.
It goes back a long time.
Yeah, but you're only talking about data matching. You're not addressing the other parts of the question. The Ombudsman report from 2017 clearly confirms that the start of this flawed scheme was under the coalition government. Do you dispute that?
The scheme at scale began in 2015, but the basis upon which it was run, which is the use of ATO average income data, goes back to the Hawke and Keating days. The Ombudsman also makes that quite clear.
But the income averaging is not the biggest problem here. Before this system was automated under your government, only 20,000 interventions were being made every year. Under this scheme, under your government, it was 20,000 a week.
Laura, the class action was all about the use of ATO averaged income. And that's exactly what this is about. It's about the sufficiency of the proof points to determine if a debt exists based on how much someone has earned per fortnight in that specific fortnight. And the whole case was about ATO averaged income data. And that's the issue that's gone back 20, 30 years, whereby governments of all persuasions since Hawke and Keating have used this exact measure to determine debt. Now, we stopped it 12 months ago almost to the day. There's been a number of court cases that have shown that this government stopping it was indeed the right thing to do.
So you're saying the practice that you engaged in was exactly the same as the Hawke and Keating governments?
The use of average income data goes back that far.
I know, but that is only a small fraction of the problem with Robodebt. You also made it possible for debts to be raised for payments going back more than 7 years, and you mistakenly issued 1 in 5 debt notices.
Laura, the process of retrieving debts over a sufficient period of time going backwards has been a long-standing practice. The way that the income compliance program was done under this government, using average income data, was exactly the same approach as being done by previous governments, except done at scale.
OK, so you issued debt notices also to natural disaster victims. Is that OK?
There's a range of issues and challenges when it comes to raising debts. Right now, we're commencing from 1 November, of course, letting people know that debts exist, and we'll start collecting debts from February next year. It's always a challenging part of the social security system that many, many ministers have had to deal with. And for so many years, for so many decades, average income data has been used, which we stopped. It was this government that stopped it, and subsequent court cases have shown that we were right to stop it. And so more proof points will now be used to ensure that debts are raised properly and sufficiently and transparently.
You even considered expanding this to vulnerable groups when you knew of the problems. As late as September of 2019, you didn't rule this out, and more than 2,000 people have died under the Robodebt scheme. Is that just a coincidence?
Oh, Laura, again, I reject that. Suicide is a very difficult topic and we need to handle it sensitively. So we reject the premise that the connectivity between suicide and Robodebt, because it is complex in terms of how we deal with those matters. But this is why we stopped the scheme in November last year, because we had concerns about the sufficiency of using this long-standing practice that governments have been using.
You had warnings, Minister, well before that. Why didn't you stop it sooner when you had these multiple warnings?
Laura, I'd only been in the portfolio for a few months before I stood in and stopped it. So as soon as I came to the conclusion that I believed that there were issues with the sufficiency of how average data was being used from the ATO, absolutely I stood in and stopped it. And stopped it on the 19th of November last year, to be precise.
And do you accept that some Australians died because of this scheme that your government pursued?
As I said, Laura, suicide is a very delicate topic and one we should tread in carefully. So I accept that the sufficiency of the scheme wasn't there, hence why I stopped it 12 months ago, and hence why we've moved to repay 705 million, 405,000 Australians, and 95% of all refunds have already occurred prior to yesterday's settlement.
Would you say that to Kath Madgwick, whose 22-year-old son Jared committed suicide, and she directly attributes the Robodebt scheme to her son's death?
Well, again, suicide is a very, very difficult subject, Laura, and any loss of Australian lives is tragic. No question about that.
You're saying you're apologetic this morning, Mr. Robert, but you don't sound that apologetic. You seem hell-bent on making comparisons between your government and this practice going back 30 years, which is only a very small fraction of the problem. So do you apologise frankly this morning? Do we need a Royal Commission?
As I've said, Laura, this is a practice that's gone back 20 or 30 years. They are just the facts of the matter, whether we wish to accept them or not. They are long-standing practice, a practice that this government stopped. And the Prime Minister has apologised, and I've certainly joined him in that, to ensure that any debts raised are done sufficiently, with substantial proof points, and more importantly, transparently, so people understand exactly what debts they've got and how they've been raised. This has now been through ostensibly 2 court cases. There's numerous Senate inquiries, including one on it at present that goes through to beginning of next year. I think this issue has been well and truly canvassed and gone through, and the government, of course, has admitted it wasn't sufficient and repaid the amount.
In fact, you told Parliament you'd never apologise. When did you change your mind?
Well, it's up to the Prime Minister to apologise on behalf of the nation.
Why, you were the Minister.
And the Prime Minister has apologised on behalf of the country, and I, of course, join him in that.